Okay. Welcome, everyone. My name is Marilyn May. I'm the chair of the Historians Committee, the Alaska Bar Association Historians Committee. And I wanted to thank you for joining us for our 21st annual, louder? Louder, okay. Thank you. Microphone, no microphone. You're welcome to go to the front of this thing. Yeah, that's all right. I can project. Okay, I'm Marilyn May, chair of the Alaska Bar Association's Historians Committee, and this is our 21st annual Historians Luncheon, and I'm glad you're all here and on Zoom. The title of our luncheon today is A Fairbanks Murder Mystery, Ted Stevens, Johnny Warren, and the Unsolved Murder of Cecil Wells. It's a fascinating story. Also here today from our committee, I believe on Zoom, are Roger Brunner and Misha Steinkruger. Joe Darnell is here in the room. Sheila Gallagher, Vic Carlson. Is Louis Grasso here? Might be. Deb Harriman. I think online are Mike Schweiger and Kelly Taylor. And then, of course, thanks very much to the CLE director, Kara Bridge, and Lynn Waddingham, who's the CLE coordinator, and they are both instrumental in getting these things off the ground and going. Before we get started, I wanted to mention a few logistics. Please silence your cell phones. And for those of you on Zoom, please mute your screens. If you have questions, be sure to speak up. The folks here in the room apparently had trouble hearing me. There's no mic, so if you have a question when the time comes, please state it loud and clear. We'll repeat it if we need to. And evaluations and certificates of attendance will be emailed to registrants next week. And right now I want to introduce Barbara Hood. She was a longtime member of the committee and is going to present a tribute to our former chair of our committee, Leroy Barker.
Can you hear me? Okay, I'll try to speak louder. Don't project as well as Marilyn. But thank you, Marilyn, and thank you to members of the Bar Historians Committee. I felt it was important to recognize today and to remember Leroy because actually it's especially appropriate to recognize Leroy today because he was the Bar Historians chair when we started the Bar Historians Luncheon 21 years ago. And he shepherded it through many years of its progress to make it a tradition. And I think it was sort of a testament to his enthusiasm for history. They were all here today, and that we continue to celebrate the stories of our past and elevate the good times of the legal history in our state. So thank you very much for letting me speak a few minutes here. I just wonder, Leroy was the chair of our historians from about 1992 to 2010 when he left the state. He first came to Alaska from his native California in 1961, just after statehood. After earning his law degree from the University of California, Berkeley, he served as one of the first assistant attorneys general after statehood with what he considered a bunch of young kids, including Vic Carlson, who is here with us today. And as they started out shaping the state of Alaska from a very early age as young people just beginning their legal careers. He returned to California after the 1964 earthquake, where he practiced for 7 years as a prosecutor. And then by the early 1970s, he and his family, including his wife, Suzanne, and his 2 young children, had returned to Alaska, where he spent about over 30 years in a career in private practice here. Throughout his career, Leroy gave very generously to the legal community in many ways. He served on the Board of Governors. He served as a fellow and state chair of the American College of Trial Lawyers, as a trustee on the Alaska Bar Foundation, including a term as president, and as a member of the Joint State Federal Court's Gender Equality Task Force, which is where I met him in the late 1990s. But it was his passion for history that led Leroy to what he considered his most important contributions. His 18-year-long tenure as president of Bar Historians saw the founding of the Joint Bench Bar Archives, which began in his garage and lived there for many years before it found a permanent home in the State Law Library at the Boney Courthouse. He also was president when we established the Nora Gwynn Award in 2007, which recognizes Alaskan that for contributions to rural history in honor of one of our state's earliest women judges, Nora Gwynn. He also forwarded and furthered the progress of the Oral History Project, which is an effort to record and preserve the stories of our the bench and the bar. All of those made headway under his watch, and the oral histories now live in the permanent collection of the University of Alaska Fairbanks Library. But most importantly for today's purposes, the first Bar Historians Luncheon was held. It's not progressing. Kara, do you? Sorry. Most significantly for today's purposes, the first bench Bar Historians. Yeah, there we go. The first Bench Bar Historians Luncheon was held in 2002. That year, we honored the surviving delegates and staff of Alaska's Constitutional Convention for an event that drew over 150 people. Guests included Tom Stewart, the convention secretary, Katie Hurley, the chief clerk, and delegates Seaborn Buckaloo, Jack Coghill, Dick Fisher, Maynard Lonborg, and George Sundberg. In 2003, we honored the early judges and clerks of the Alaska court system. Familiar faces included Judge Russell Holland, Jerry Kurtz, Judge James Vonderheit, Judge James Fitzgerald, and Robert Ely. I think it's telling to note and kind of underscores the importance of our work that most of these people are no longer with us. In 2005, we again featured the delegates to Alaska's Constitutional Convention, this time focused on Article 4, the Judiciary article, with a presentation by Alaska Supreme Court Justice Warren Matthews. In 2007, the subject was the history of privacy in Alaska, with attorney Jeff Feldman, Judge Morgan Kristen, Alaska Supreme Court Justice Alex Brenner, and attorney Mark Ashbourne. In 2008, brought perhaps our most amusing program when the Cole brothers out of Fairbanks, Terrence and Dermot, joined with Anchorage journalist and historian Michael Carey to tell stories of Judge James Wickersham during frontier days. I don't think anyone in attendance at that luncheon could ever say history wasn't fun. In 2009, we celebrated the 50th anniversary of statehood with a wonderful program we called Voices That Carried, which featured Talis Colberg, Judge Karen Hunt, and Joe Josephson, and used original recordings from the Constitutional Convention to illuminate the creation of Alaska's 3 branches of government. And then finally, in 2010, the last luncheon Leroy shepherded was entitled, But Can She Type? And featured founding members of the Anchorage Association of Women Lawyers, Linda O'Bannon, Judge Karen Hunt, and Judge Elaine Andrews, with moderator Jessica Carey Grant. As you can see, Leroy had a gift for bringing people together and a well-deserved reputation for grace and humility. One of my favorite memories is when he agreed to help me protect some archival materials that I needed to take to the old Kinko's copy shop to have copied for a display we were working on. And he walked in and he looked around and goes, wow, look at all these machines. And it sort of underscored the generational difference, because when Leroy spent most of his legal career, they didn't have copy machines, needless, much less rooms full of them. And then, but what was really telling to me and moving to me that day was that Leroy stood guard very seriously for several hours so that none of the materials of the archive that he valued so much would be damaged or destroyed. And I thought it just spoke volumes to what a special person he was. So it wasn't surprising to me to learn later that Leroy was the only member of the Alaska Bar Association to ever receive the Professionalism Award, which he received in 1990, and the Distinguished Service Award, which he received in 2009 for his service to the Alaska for the Bar Historians. After Leroy retired, he and Suzanne left Alaska in 2010 to settle in Portland, but he remained an active member of the Bar Historians Committee for the rest of his life and continued his love of legal history. When I visited in 2014 with our mutual friend, the late historian Beverly Beaton, Leroy made sure we attended a historical event at Portland's Pioneer Courthouse, where he already seemed to know everyone. As always, Leroy made new friends quickly and easily when history was involved. As Alaskans who value bar history, we're fortunate that Leroy was such a good friend for so many years to all of us. And I, for one, will very much miss getting the phone call saying, hey, it's me, Leroy, because I always knew that meant a good time was in store. Thank you, Leroy. We love you and we miss you.
Thanks so much, Barb. That was really fun. It was great to see all those pictures with Leroy in them. We really miss him. Now it's my honor to present today's speaker, James T. Bartlett, author of The Alaskan Blonde, Sex, Secrets, and the Hollywood Story That Shocked America. His full biography is available online, but I'm just going to provide a few highlights here. Is Debbie, where's Debbie? Is Angela here?
No, not yet.
Okay, we hope to have here in the back of the room, I think, Angela Lebor from Tidal Wave Books is planning to come, and she will have the books available. If not, if you haven't read it, you should pick one up either here or at Tidal Wave, and they make great gifts with Christmas coming. Yeah. Anthony Award nominated and National Indie Excellence Award winner, James Bartlett, lives in LA, but has developed a true interest in Alaska. He's a travel and lifestyle journalist and historian and has written for many publications. It's a long list that is pretty fascinating, but I'm not going to read it all here. In addition to The Alaskan Blonde, he's written 2 gourmet ghosts books that look really fun about the history, ghost stories, and crimes behind some of LA's oldest bars, restaurants, and hotels. And this led to numerous radio and TV appearances, including on Ghost Adventures and The Unexplained with William Shatner. And one of the biographies that I saw included this sentiment that I thought was very fun. James feels that life was more exciting when you could buy poison at every corner store. He's the perfect person to shed light on this interesting Alaskan mystery. So without further ado, I'll turn the program over to James.
Well, hello, everybody. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
You can? Oh, good. I feel like I can see in the corner there where I am. It feels like it's 1984 and I'm Big Brother. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, you can.
Yes.
You can hear me. I'm just so you can hear me. You can hear me well, and you can hear me clearly.
Yes.
Okay. Obviously, you. Yeah, I was going to say perhaps everyone who's on Zoom could mute, and I will go. I'll go to share screen, and we'll go from there. So I don't know if anybody. You have to let me know if you can see this. Let's see. Now, can everybody see that?
Yes.
Yep.
Okay, good. So obviously the first thing you'll recognize is I have an English accent, despite living in Los Angeles. But I'm not in England today. I am in Los Angeles. So I'll crack on with this because I know it's already 12:30. So thank you very much for coming. Thank you, especially for all of you who braved the weather to come here today, because I've been keeping an eye on the weather and I've seen it's been absolutely dreadful in terms of snow. So thanks for those of you who've actually turned up, and welcome to all of you who are actually on Zoom as well. Has anybody, and I guess I'm not quite sure if I can see this, but so you may have to say, has anybody read the book yet? And is it going to be able to catch me out? If it is, say so. On this particular screen, I can't see what's happening, but you can see me. So if anyone's read it, please shout out, say, yes, I have.
Yeah.
Oh, good. That's good.
Yes.
That's great. And is there anyone here today from Fairbanks?
Certainly.
Oh,
Yes.
good. That's great. Good. That's great. I don't know if they might have come to one of my talks there, or if we met, and if so, hello. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to lead you through this story. As you said, it's Fairbanks murder mystery, Ted Stevens, Johnny Warren, and the unsolved murder of Cecil Wells. Now, I don't need to tell you who Ted Stevens is. So I'm going to obviously be very, very brief in relation to him and his connection to this story, which happened very, very early in his career. So what we'll do is we'll try and get it going and go to the, yes, there we go. There's the first one. And that's just sort of how I start things. This is a couple of quotes that I think sum up the story a great deal. As I hope you can read them, but I'll read them out as well. All of the facts are not known and may never be, but enough became public to make the Alaska murder case, which was what a lot of the newspapers in the lower 48 called it, a grim thriller that outdid anything invented by mystery writers like James Cain, Rex Stout, or Mickey Spillane, which is a great quote. And then you mentioned Terence and Dermot just recently, the two historians there, both of whom helped me with this book or spoke to me about the book. Terence said in his book, Fighting for the 49th Star, it remains to this day the most notorious and baffling case in the history of Fairbanks. Now, I don't know, it did obviously happen 70 years ago. The 70th anniversary was just a couple of weeks ago. Does anybody remember it at all? I can't imagine anyone's old enough in the room to remember it, been there at the time, but they may have heard some talk of it. If so, perhaps you could mention it at the end or put something in the chat for the questions, because I'd love to hear if anyone remembered it at all, because obviously it was a long time ago and a lot of the people I spoke to were children or teenagers at the time. So I'm going to start the story by talking about the victim in this particular case. The book is called The Alaskan Blonde. We'll talk about who the Alaskan Blonde is later, but the victim was Cecil Wells, who was born in Litchfield in Pennsylvania in 1902. Some of you may have read about him in the past. He was a pioneer in Alaska. He spent a lot of time initially in Anchorage as well, where he set up top right his auto business and repair business and industrial machines and tractors and so forth. That's what he was very much known throughout his life, as having the car dealership. As you can see, it's Wells Alaska Motors. There is a place in Anchorage called Alaska Sales and Service, which was one of his original businesses in Anchorage. It's still a car dealership. And I actually got in touch with them researching the book, and they found some old documents and things from back in his day. So he started doing that in Anchorage initially, and then moved up to Fairbanks. And he was one of the pioneers in bringing actual physical cars to Alaska, so that they would be on the lot for people to see and to drive, because as you know, they would usually be shipped here, or you would pick them from a catalog. So he was a pioneer in that kind of thing. You can see top left, there's a picture of him as a younger man with an enormous moose there. And that looks like I forget, is it a 60-inch? But that looks pretty impressive. My bottom left, he was an investor in the Chena Hot Springs, which, if any of you know, Fairbanks is a very famous tourist location there. So he was an investor in that. He was a very successful businessman by the time this story begins, as it were. He had some interest in a gold mine, which you can see him working in the middle there. And he was kind of a bit of a player. He was a player within Alaska at the time. This is territorial Alaska, of course. He was just been elected chair of the All Alaska Chamber of Commerce. And in 1947, in the corner, you see that, believe it or not, that's Walt Disney. Walt Disney and his daughter and a number of other businessmen came up to Alaska in 1947 to do some research and to look into some business interests. And Cecil showed them around. There are some family photos of them, and that's Walt Disney there on the right. There are a couple of other pictures of Walt's daughter. So Cecil was an important man. He was a well-known man. He was a significant man in not necessarily in politics, but certainly within the community of Alaska. He was pro-statehood. He was a very big deal, certainly in Fairbanks and Anchorage as well. He was well known in both those cities. The other person, the main person that covers the book covers, is the Alaskan Blonde, which is Diane Wells. There'll be a couple of pictures of her in a minute. And she was born Dizzy Diana Baker in Portland, Oregon in 1922. Her early life after her parents split up, she spent a lot of time in San Francisco and Monterey in California, and actually some time in an orphanage as well. And that's the admissions book there on the top right-hand corner. And that's she was submitted by her mother. Her mother, Florence, took her there. And she was there for about 14 months before her mother came and collected her. It wasn't kind of daycare, apparently. The Maria Kipp Orphanage, of which there's a picture on the left. It wasn't daycare, it was an orphanage. It wasn't unusual for parents, for whatever reason, to bring their children there for a while. So Diana, or Diane, as she became better known, or was mainly called, was spent a lot of time there as a younger child. She was just about 6, 7 years old. And her mother, Florence, ended up making pottery and decorative plates. As you can see, there's one there of San Francisco for the tourist industry in San Francisco. She went under the name Yvonne, art by Yvonne. So that's one of her plates. So that's Diane Wells. She's the Alaskan blonde of this story. And talking about Diane Baker, as she was, she married very young, at 16, to Donald Walker, who actually ended up being a state trooper in Washington State. Actually, he spent a number of years as a state trooper. There's a picture of her on the left, Diane as a younger woman. And then in the middle is a picture of Sandra, which was their first child, who was born in November 1939. She took Sandra's middle name, Diane, not Diana, you notice, Diane, Sandra. And then on the right-hand side is Diane's other daughter with her first husband, Bonnie, who's on the right, Sandra's on the left. And that's Sandra and Bonnie with their grandmother, their paternal grandmother, who they spent a lot of time with, living with later in their lives, as is discussed in the book, and as is discussed, I'll talk about in this talk, because obviously the background is important to the two people. And this is a picture of Diane Wells at the time of the murder, and at the 6-month period, followed the murder up to her time in Los Angeles. And as you can see, she's got quite the look of film noir about her. That was a dyed blonde hair, that was fur coats, mink jackets. I mean, she was Cecil's 5th wife, and she was 20 years younger than he was. So it was a trophy wife, and the family members mentioned that they were very fond of her, but they were kind of clear that he had, at a 51-year-old man, he'd got a younger wife, and he treated her very well, lots of jewelry and fur coats and so forth. But these were some of the pictures. These were taken at Seattle airport, actually. But as you can see, she's quite striking. And Front Page Detective magazine actually called her the most beautiful woman in Alaska. And when I was doing the interviews with people from around that time, they all said that to me. It wasn't an exaggeration. They said, men and women, that she was exceptionally attractive. She was very, very much considered gorgeous for the age, and within the town of Fairbanks especially. Pretty much everyone had a crush on her, every man. That was what I was told. So that's Diane Wells, the Alaskan blonde. She met Cecil in Seattle, and she had spent a number of years working in California, as I said, where she had spent a lot of her time working in the I. Magnin and Company department store, which some of you may have remembered. They were a chain sort of in California and the West Coast. Those are a couple of pictures of the store. She was a runway model, which some of you, I'm sure, probably don't even remember. But back in the day, department stores used to have a runway in their women's department, especially as they would call it, the women's department. And models would come out modeling the dresses and the clothes for women, such as you see in the picture there, to have a look at. So Diane was one of those runway models. And that, not there was where she met Cecil, but she met him sometime soon after that, and she would have said that she was a model, which was true at the time. So they met in Seattle, and they were married in September 1949 in Fairbanks. Pretty much the day after they both arrived there in Fairbanks. They were both married, and their son Marquam, or Mark, as how he was called, was born in August the following year. Now, if any of you know Oregon at all, or Portland especially, the Marquam family were an enormously important and influential family going back 100 years, and their name is still in a lot of places in Portland, and they were connected to the Marquam family through Diane, through an earlier adoption, and through her parents. So that was the Marquam was a family name. So they called their son Mark. You can see top right, he has the same sort of blonde hair, curly hair. Top left is a picture of Diane with the latest Cadillac Eldorado. Cecil being an automobile dealer, he always had the latest Eldorado. So there's a picture of her modeling, I guess, the latest Eldorado. And then on bottom left and right, as you know, Alaska has a very strong connection to Hawaii for a number of reasons. So in the 50s, it was very common to have Hawaiian parties and Hawaiian themed parties. There was a lot of travel between the two territories, as they both were then. So there's a picture of Diane at one of the Hawaiian parties, and Cecil and Diane got to travel a lot as well, which was quite unusual at the time. They went to Peru and Brazil and Mexico, and they got to travel quite a lot, which is more than most people did. So they were together. They seemed to be an extremely happy couple. They were what we would call kind of an it couple today. They were very much sort of high profile. And then in the picture in the middle, that's a picture I was given by one of the family members. In fact, all of these are from family members. That's very much a picture to me. As you can see, it's a Christmas picture. There's the tree on the right-hand side, and there's Diane at the back. There's Cecil in the middle with his suit on and a drink in his hand, and there's young Mark in his arm. And to me, that's a very quintessential sort of 1950s picture, very much sort of reflecting the social structures of the time. You know, Cecil was the breadwinner. He worked and he wore a suit and he had a cocktail when he came home. And Diane was the homemaker, and she looked after the children after their son. It actually turned out that their marriage was technically illegal. Now, this was not a surprise. Family members did kind of know this. And I guess in many ways, it depends on your opinion. I mean, you're all lawyers in this room, which I am not. So it depends how you would feel about this. But in the 50s, there was no communication between any of these places. I mean, this was territorial in stake for a start, but there was no communication between the places to check if someone was actually divorced or so forth, I would imagine, or it wasn't easily checkable unless you had a real reason. So as you can see, that's the marriage certificate, and it's Cecil's name on the left, and Shelley Diane Walker. Now, I don't know where the Shelley came from. She made that up. Walker was the name of her first husband, but she'd actually been married in between. She'd been married to another guy in Seattle for less than a year and was not fully divorced from him yet. It was about another 6 months before the full decree came through. So technically, you may be able to correct me in this room here, but that means they technically couldn't be married because she was technically not divorced. It didn't affect things later on in relation to wills and probate and so forth, which you think it might have done if it was a very common, well-known secret. But I thought that was interesting in the fact that the two of them wanted to be together so much that they would fudge the details, let's say, that they would fudge a marriage certificate. The interesting thing being is that Cecil had already been involved with the law in relation to marriage. He never held political office because he couldn't. He had been convicted of, well, what is essentially adultery back way back at the beginning of the century. And he'd actually served 18 months in McNeil Island, which is an island prison in Washington state. He and another woman lived together. They were married to other people and they lived together for a certain time, and that was illegal. So they were both charged with that. And he went to prison for that for about 13 months as a result, and she was fined. But when he came out of McNeil, he married her. Maud Rauderbar, her name was. So that was his second wife. And he married her when he came out of prison. So he was not averse, Cecil Wells, shall we say, to doing something for love. I mean, that's what I looked at it as. It was doing something for love. He went to prison for love, and perhaps he just wanted to marry Diane, and they would know, she knew that she wasn't quite divorced. So he said, look, just put a different name. I mean, that could be conjecture, but I think that's what might have happened because, again, this is the 1950s. Remember, people didn't really live together. There was no sort of cohabiting. You kind of got married. You know, it was very common at the time for people to be married 3 or 4 or 5 times. You know, Diane was Cecil's 5th wife. So, you know, it was a common thing. But so that's their marriage. So now we're in Fairbanks. They've been living there a couple of years, 2 or 3 years. Some of you might know this picture from Fairbanks. You've probably seen this postcard. But that's sort of the main drag in Fairbanks. That looks great. As you can see, there's possibly someone in uniform to the left at the bottom. There's a small population in the early 50s, as a lot of the cities around Alaska were, not including military. So it's a small place, small town. That's where they were living. And they lived in the Northwood building, which, if there is anybody from Fairbanks there or anybody watching, they definitely know this building. The building is still there. It was considered to be the high-end skyscraper of its day when it was built in 1952. It opened in 1952. It was like a service building like they used to be, as you can see from the pictures. There would be a drugstore on the street level. There would be a grocery, perhaps. There would be a barber shop. There would be a bank. There would be a bar. All of these things would be on the ground floor so that you never had to leave unless you wished to. You know, even the car parking spaces underneath were heated. So this was like the skyscraper of its day. It's a very fashionable building. Hence, Diane and Cecil and their son Mark moved in. They had lived just across the river and moved into here pretty much soon enough after it opened, because they were a powerful couple. His dealership was right nearby. He was very much involved in local politics. So of course they would be living in the fancy building in town, in downtown, on the 8th floor, which is the top floor. They actually had 2 apartments that were kind of not knocked through together, but they took 2 apartments. So they lived in the Northwood building. And here's where the story really begins, is the murder. This is the only slightly bloody picture you're going to see. So that's Cecil in his bed, and you can see probably from that, and again, this is a room full of lawyers watching and a room full of lawyers on Zoom. You can see he's been shot while he's asleep. You can see pretty much close to the side of the head somewhere. It doesn't look like he necessarily knew what happened. On the right is a picture of Diane. As you can see there, she has two black eyes and a bruised and cut face. And she told police that 2 men had broken into the apartment in the early hours of the morning of October the 17th. They had pretty much shot Cecil straight away. They pretty much shot him straight away and then beat her up. And when she regained consciousness, she banged on the door of a neighbor. They're quite thin corridors within the building. She banged on the door of a neighbor, and the police were summoned, and the investigation began. Now, this was a huge story, certainly within Alaska, but it soon became a story that broke out of Alaska and became a story that actually was in newspapers around the world, and there is a reason for that. But this is what happened with the murder, and it was such a big story that, seeing as I put this in especially today because you're in Anchorage, it knocked the opening of the airport in Anchorage off the headline of the day. Cecil and Diane were supposed to fly down in his Cessna to the opening of the Anchorage airport because, like I say, he was head of the All Alaska Chamber of Commerce, and they were supposed to fly down on that day. And of course, he was murdered instead, and that was the headline in the Anchorage Daily Times, which gives you an idea of how important he was, how much of a big deal this murder was. The airport did open, obviously, as you can see underneath, but it wasn't the headline of the day, which you would have thought it would be. Now, finally, as I'm sure you've all been waiting for, Ted Stevens comes into the story. Now, like I said, I looked him up this morning. He had a lot of connections to California, actually. He served in the Navy in World War II. He got a degree in political science at UCLA here in Los Angeles, and then he went to Harvard. And he worked briefly in DC before he got the appointment as the district attorney in Fairbanks. Again, it was a territory, not a state. And he was very young, obviously born in 1923. So he would be 30, 29, 30. So he was very new in town. People in Fairbanks were a little wary of him. He was an outsider. He was a Chichaco, as I believe the word was called. Next to him is a picture of the Fairbanks chief of police at the time. Looks like a World War I flying ace there. He was an ex-cop, San Diego cop, actually. He was born in Rhode Island, 1914. He was called E.V. Danforth. Everett was his name. He was new in the job as well. Now, some of you, again, having a legal education background, may know something about the prison and legal system in Alaska at the time. They had just handed over the control of the prisons, and there was a lot of problems with the prisons in Alaska. They were very poorly funded and maintained. The staff weren't great. There were problems with the police and law enforcement generally as well. That's another question that I'm sure many of you can tell me more about. But my point being is that E.V. Danforth was the chief of police. Ted Stevens was the new DA, very, very new in their jobs, both of them, just a few months. This was a huge deal. This was a high-profile murder. This was a high-profile case for them. But they had evidence. The autopsy said that it was probably a Beretta 380 that was the murder weapon. There were some markings on the 2 cartridges, which there's an example of one there, and there's the picture from the FBI file, because obviously I got the FBI file from through a Freedom of Information request, which I'm sure, again, all of you know well about. So there was an identification mark on one of the 2 cartridges that were found. So they just needed to find the gun to link the 2 up. So initially, it seemed like it was potentially a particularly easy open and shut case, hopefully, a robbery turned violent. That was what they were looking at initially. They had fingerprints as well. You can see them top left. There were some pictures over on a Johnny Walker whiskey bottle. I actually looked it up. I did all the research to find out what kind of whiskey bottle it was. When you do research in a book like this, you go to extreme lengths sometimes. So I actually found out which label that was and which it's a red label, Johnny Walker red label. So there were bloody fingerprints on a bottle of whiskey. So they had those. On the right-hand side, you can see there were 24 cartridges that were sent to the FBI very soon after the murder, looking for that match, looking for something that combined the 2. And Hoover took a personal interest in this case. At least initially, he started to sign the documents that came back to E.V. Danforth that went to and from, because, of course, all the evidence was sent to the FBI for testing. Fairbanks, of course, did not have any facilities for anything like that. But Hoover signed some of the documents. He called E.V. Danforth, my dear chief, at least early on. At least early on in the case, he called him my dear chief. And then at the bottom of the picture there is something I added for interest here. That's the last physical evidence left from the case. These red coral brooch necklace things. There's a quarter next to them for scale. They were in the archives at Juneau, unexpectedly in an envelope. They'd been kept from the scene of the crime. I would imagine it was possibly a necklace or a bracelet that Diane perhaps had been wearing when she was assaulted, and they had kept the pieces. There were more pieces than there, probably because they thought they had blood on them, perhaps. But that's the only physical evidence left. So the investigation had a lot of physical evidence and seemed to be progressing. They took witness statements, witness accounts. People within the Northwood building said they heard arguments and they heard shouting and screaming and the child crying occasionally in the Wells's apartment. But that's not necessarily something that was unusual at the time. But so they had plenty to go on, and it was an important case. However, there were problems. Gunshot residue, which again, I'm not going to explain to any of you what that is, but there was a test done by the FBI on gunshot residue on some pajamas, and they ended up being what I called, you can see Hoover's signature there, they ended up being what I called the disappearing pajamas, because there are actually 2 pairs of pajamas. As I'm sure you know, there are always strange things that happen in criminal cases in the real world that you would never believe in fiction. So what had happened with these pajamas was that when Diane and Cecil had gone to bed the night of the murder, Diane had been wearing pajamas or night clothes, I guess whatever you would call them, depending on the term. And she'd actually been sick during the night on her clothes. So she'd taken them off, put them in the bathroom and left them, I guess, in the laundry basket or even on the floor. I mean, I think we've all done that. And she had worn a pair of Cecil's pajamas. He'd given her a pair of her pajamas to wear. And the police took the wrong pair of pajamas away. They left the ones that she had been wearing around, that would have been around the time of the murder. They took the ones that she was wearing after the murder. Now, the ones after the murder had her blood stains on them from being beaten up. But of course, they should have taken the first pair of pajamas to see if there was any gunshot residue, to see if she might have been wearing them, if she'd been involved in what happened. They didn't. They weren't on the list of the FBI. They went later, and they didn't find any gunshot residue on the pair that she wore, if you follow me. So the pajamas were a bit of a thing. There were a couple of other problems with the forensic evidence too. E.V. Danforth, the chief of police, decided, I'm sure because he wanted to get out in front of the investigation, he sent the fingerprints to the local hospital to be analyzed. Now, again, this is in the 50s. They could only tell a blood group. There was no DNA or anything like that to be more specific. They didn't do a good job on it. They didn't come back with a solid answer, and the fingerprint evidence never panned out to be anything useful. Now, over the years, they sent about 10 people's fingerprint cards, as they were in those days, to the FBI to compare with these fingerprints. They never got a match. And that being taken to the local hospital kind of ruined the samples that they have. So they lost the fingerprint evidence early on. And that was Danforth trying to get ahead of the investigation because it became excuse the language, but again, you'll know this, it became a bit of a pissing match between all the law enforcement authorities. You know, Danforth was city police. He felt it was a city police matter. There was Stevens as well as the DA. He was fully involved. There was also the FBI who became involved, as you can see. There was also the US Marshal Service that became involved. All these law enforcement groups were all involved in this case, and they were all getting in each other's way and not helping, which I'm sure you've come across or will come across. I'm just trying to set out, is this all making sense so far? Somebody say yes.
Yes.
Okay, good. Another strange thing that they found from some of the evidence from the crime scene was something that many of you may remember. You may have read this book back in the day called The Prophet. It's like a sort of a new age masterpiece type story. And it was set at page 46 when the police came and investigated the apartment. And one of the quotes, which were actually the page before page 46, is that quote lower down there, which says, "If any of you would bring to judgment the unfaithful wife, let him also weigh the heart of her husband in scales and measure his soul with measurements," which is pretty cryptical. One of those great things that happens, but the police took that away. That was Diane's book. They took that away. They felt that was important. She'd marked that page. And this was the reason there was a real problem around the case. Not only was it a high-profile person who'd been murdered, Cecil Wells, this had been the first of several high-profile men who'd been murdered. They had all been home invasions, 2 men breaking in, drinking or taking whiskey, and one earlier in the year, 1953, a businessman called Tommy Wright had been murdered in his home when his wife was there. That crime was unsolved. People were angry, people were upset, people were scared within Fairbanks. It was become a political issue here, as you can see on the right. There was a big movement towards basically criticizing the police and saying that the police aren't doing enough and that there needs to be real changes here. And so Tommy Wright had been killed earlier in the year. Now there was Cecil. There had been another one a couple of years before, another prominent rich businessman. And there was actually another one during the course of the investigation of this case. Again, another rich businessman, 2 men broke into the home, said that they wanted money. And in this 4th case, they actually said, Tommy Wright and Cecil Rails were killed. You're next. So it could be that there was the suggestion of a gang that was targeting the wealthy people in Fairbanks. And this was a problem, obviously, within Fairbanks, but it had greater repercussions, as I'll discuss a little. But this is the background of the case and where the investigation is going. So we're moving into November. Then someone drops a dime, as they call it. Someone drops a dime to the police station and said that Diane had been having an affair. Now, that man on the left is Johnny Warren, born in Columbia, Mississippi in 1919. He was a local musician. He's got advertisements like, there is in the middle of the page, all over the Fairbanks Daily News Miner for years. He was a gigging, working musician who played all the clubs. He'd been in music for a long time. He had obviously a day job as well. He worked at the Piggly Wiggly, which I'm sure many of you remember. That was in Fairbanks. But the person who called the police said that Johnny and Diane had been having an affair. And when the newspapers picked up on this in the magazines, this was the picture that kind of went in all the newspapers to show. So you have on the left there, newspapers used to put the little arrows in, so you know who was there. But as you can see, there's Diane there looking very glamorous. Cecil next to her, up at the top table there, as you can see, near the radio microphone, KFAR. And then behind them is the band. You can see it's been touched up a little, but that's Johnny playing the guitars. He played a number of instruments. They were supposed to have met at this country club dinner on Labor Day. That was the first time they're supposed to have met. This is in September, obviously, Labor Day. And they had met. So they'd only been, if anything had been happening, it had only been a few weeks. But the fact that Johnny became involved in this case changed it entirely, because this is 1953 Jim Crow America, or territorial America. That became a bigger scandal and a bigger headline grabber than the actual murder did. The fact that a white woman and a black man may have been having an affair was an absolute scandal. It absolutely exploded the story. And of course, added much more pressure onto Stevens and to Danforth and all the other people investigating the case. So Johnny Warren kind of took the advantage, and he had actually left Fairbanks the night of the murder, which people thought was very suspicious, but turned out not to be so. He was down in Oakland, California, visiting his sister. I'm sure he got a phone call of some kind. And so he called the police and said, I want to come in and talk about what had happened. So he wanted to get in front of the story as well. And he gave a 19-page, I think it was 19 pages or 19 hours, or perhaps it was 19 hours and 19 pages, a very long interview to two detectives in Oakland. And he said absolutely that there had been intimate relations, quote unquote, was the word he used, with Diane. And he was pretty specific about some times and places, you know, they had met. Again, if anyone there is from Fairbanks, they would meet at the Polaris building. Johnny had a friend who had an apartment in the Polaris building, which was the other skyscraper in downtown Fairbanks. And he and Diane met there several times. They met in the Wells's apartment as well, apparently, because of course they couldn't have ever wandered around town together because it's a very small town and everyone would have thought, why are those two together? So he definitely confirmed that he and Diane had been intimate, that they'd been having an affair. She seemed very, very keen on him less so. She said that she was even perhaps unhappy in her marriage and would be interested in being with him. She said that, you know, the color difference didn't bother her at all. But this, of course, made the story a sensation. And that meant, of course, it was covered in Ebony and in Jet. It got covered in Life. It got covered in Newsweek. And as you can see from the headline, trysts is not really a word that we hear anymore. If anyone doesn't know what that is, it can be explained by someone else in the room. But tryst is like a romantic entanglement, an affair, a hot and passionate affair. So Johnny had said, yes, we were having an affair. Now, of course, you had the idea of a conspiracy. There was the potential for a conspiracy. And sure enough, Ted Stevens, understandably, completely locked onto this. The grand jury was actually sitting at the time in Fairbanks. They only sat once a year for about 4 weeks. And he desperately tried to get this to the top of the pile. Obviously, it went higher being a murder case. But again, as you all know, and I'm not going to explain it to you, the differences between territorial and state and how grand juries work and so forth. So I'm not going to explain that to you. But the outshot was there are arrest warrants issued for Johnny and Diane, both for first-degree murder, which you can see on the left there. That's a copy of the warrant, or at least the documents relating to it. And so the warrants go out, and as you can see, bottom right, Oakland drummer held, jazz man, widow seized in murder. He was a jazz man. So the arrest warrants go out, and here it gets a little more interesting. On the right-hand side, there's Diane in the middle. That's her coming back from Seattle. You know, we saw the pictures of her with the black fur coat. That's her carrying Mark. Now, she had been arrested in Seattle at the airport and taken into Seattle and told about the charges that she was facing, and then been sent back, or had gone back on the midnight plane. So that was her coming back to Fairbanks. On the right-hand side, later in the month, in November, because we're moving into November now, the US Marshals Service send a man named Frank Worth down to Oakland, down to California, to extradite Johnny, to bring him back, to face the charges. And I was very lucky enough to get the private notes of Frank Worth, who is the guy on the left there. And this picture was among his notes. And as you can see, it's not a picture that ever got published, because a picture like that would probably never be allowed to be put into a newspaper, because it looks like there's Frank and Johnny in handcuffs. This is at the airport, and they're both smiling and they're both laughing. And the family told me that Frank Worth said that he liked Johnny Warren. He said they talked about music all the way home. They both played guitar. They were both fans of music. And Frank Worth, very unusually for a criminal case, publicly and privately said that he didn't think Johnny Warren had anything to do with it, which is very unusual. So that was a picture from Frank's Worth's memoirs, and he was very clear that he didn't think Johnny Warren had anything to do with it, publicly and privately, because of course, when you're researching a book, what people say publicly might be completely different to what they say publicly. But that wasn't the case with Frank Worth. So long story short, they're both arrested. They're both brought back to Fairbanks. Johnny only has the money to get out to local bond. He has to stay within Fairbanks or probably within Alaska. Diane does have some money. She is the executor of Cecil's will. I mean, there is some money available, but that quickly disappears. But she posts the $10,000 bail, probably paid for by the Wells family. And she flies to Los Angeles, flies back out again. She and Mark fly back to Los Angeles, and she never goes back to Alaska again. And that's a picture of her at LAX, Los Angeles Airport. It's the only picture publicly where you see her smiling. That's the only picture where you see her smiling, is when she's come down to Los Angeles, which she may have spent some time in as a younger person. You know, she lived in California, in San Francisco. The family said that she did come to Hollywood to try and be an actress, but I think any attractive woman of the age would have probably said at the time they tried to be famous in Hollywood. But she went to Los Angeles to try and get away, because she was in Fairbanks and there was a lot of gossip and a lot of rumors, mainly about her. The rumors weren't about Johnny. The local population in Fairbanks was very much on his side. They really didn't think he had anything to do with it. He stayed employed at the Piggly Wiggly. He kept doing his gigs. He was even given a job at the Wells Motor Company, at the car dealership. The new owner was so convinced that he had nothing to do with it, he made a public stand and employed Johnny Warren there, which is quite something. So that's where we are. So we've had the arrests and we've had them bailed. So the FBI begin the investigation of the case, and they're looking for a conspiracy. These things here, again, you will probably recognize, they're a handwriting test on the right there. So they made Diane do a number of sentences. You can see the evidence number on the sides. She writes a number of sentences, all of which you don't need to read them because they don't make any sense, but they're obviously just saying some words that they figure would have been in some of the love letters, one of which is on the left, which is kind of like it's kind of a sweet little poem. It's kind of teenagery type poem that allegedly Diane sent to Johnny. Now, of course, Johnny must have handed over the love letters to the police. I mean, no one else would have got them. If he had got them, you know, he wouldn't have sent them back to Diane. She certainly would have handed them over, because she made it quite clear throughout the case, throughout everything that happened, it was two men that broke in, and she never had an affair with Johnny Warren. She stuck to that all the way through. So you have the love letters here, allegedly, on the left. You have the handwriting test on the right, and you don't even really need to see the screen here, but it's clearly her handwriting. There are some very obvious links, especially the D in Diane, or the way she uses a D. So the FBI were very able to mix that Johnny and Diane were connected, which means there could be a conspiracy. Again, some of the media coverage, which was pretty excessive. I mentioned some of the newspapers. There were a lot of pulp magazines at the time, a lot of detective magazines. They covered it, especially. The Sunday News was in New York in 1956, a few years later, which I'll get to. So there's a picture of Johnny when he was arrested. There's that kind of iconic picture it became of Diane at Seattle, looking quite terrified. If you see the cover of the book, there's a picture of kind of that picture of her with two guys holding up the flashes, the cameramen. That was sort of an iconic picture. Then on the top right, you've got Newsweek, and they called the story "The Case of the Beat Up Blonde." And they recreated what she said had happened to her there. So that was a local news reporter, actually, and he was pretending to be the one of the assailants. So as you can see, grabbed her behind and bashed her on the head with something that was nearby, which was actually like, you know, like a small, like you might have a cactus or a small house plant in it. She said that she was bashed over the head a couple of times with two of those flower pots. And there was earth and smashed pottery and so forth in the apartment. So she'd been bashed on those in the head, and that had knocked her unconscious by one of the two assailants. And then you've got a piece on the left, which is a little more follows the tone of the media coverage, Death and the Midas Touch. Very much was made of Cecil being very rich, and that Diane was a very young fifth wife, and that she was going to get all the money. And the implication being is that she'd been a gold digger or a card girl, as they used to call them, and that she had been involved from the beginning. And that was one of the aspects of the case that made this seem very modern to me. I think we still judge very much along these lines. And you'll have found this, I'm sure, in your work, or you'll find in your work, that if there's a younger wife and occasionally a younger lover, a male lover, we always think they did it. The natural assumption, especially if she's a blonde or we naturally go to that assumption. So that was very much how they judged her. And like I said, the Pulp Fiction magazines, you know, there's the odd cover there on the left from Official Detective Stories. And this is January 1954. So this is a couple of months after the murder. Behind the Fairbanks, Alaska slaying, the millionaire, the fifth wife, and the drummer boy, which of course has a slight tinge of racism to it, using the word boy to describe a black guy. But you can see the cover, it's a Happy New Year thing. And whether that's meant to be Diane or not, I have absolutely no idea. She's going through a wallet and there's a table of jewelry, whatever it is. But that was the feature story in that edition. And then in March that same year, that's a very racy cover there, Too Fond of a Blonde. Fairbanks, Alaska, Too Fond of a Blonde. And presumably that's what they thought the blonde was involved in the case. That was Five Star Detective magazine. Unfortunately, as you might imagine, it ends pretty badly and pretty sadly. There was a trial date set, which was for April 1954, because we've moved into April. Diane had moved down to Los Angeles. There were family friends there who she stayed with initially, but the strain was clearly taking its toll. She was already on barbiturate tablets. I realized this is quite a shock. I didn't realize, I was going to say I didn't give you any warning to this that was going to happen, but she and Mark had been down in Los Angeles and had seemed to be well. He had been enrolled in school. She had been staying with this family friends. But in February of 1954, she moved out and moved into a hotel on Hollywood Boulevard called the Drake Hotel, which is still there today. It's not a hotel anymore, but the hotel is still there now. Why she moved into a hotel, I don't know. Maybe she wanted some privacy. Maybe she felt like she'd overstayed her welcome. But either way, she moved into this Drake Hotel, and one of her friends warned the manager, please keep an eye on her, because she was taking barbiturates. She was clearly depressed and very upset, and people were worried. On March the 9th, she checked out of that hotel. Well, she didn't check out. She left the hotel, went round the corner onto Hollywood and Vine, which is about 3 or 4 blocks, and checked into a hotel called the Hollywood Plaza Hotel. She sat down, took 20 to 30 barbiturates, and started writing a couple of notes. She left a couple at the hotel first. She left a couple at this hotel. They get more and more incoherent as it goes on. But the point being, the one thing that people wanted to know, and of course the newspapers printed suicide notes, which we would never do today, but did she leave a note about the murder? If she was going to kill herself, this was her last moments. What did she say about the murder? Did she do it? Because the Stevens and Danforth and the investigation was still struggling. They still hadn't found the murder weapon. It had kind of come to a halt. Chief of Police Danforth had resigned at the end of November. I mean, he hadn't been getting anywhere. So he had resigned, and Stevens was kind of leading the charge. So the note that she left, that you can make of it what you will, it reads, for one thing, I am guilty too for ever seeing Warren, if Warren is guilty. One thing for sure is Cecil is dead, and I must be the cause of it, one way or another. Now, whether you take that to be a confession or something that's rambling, I don't know. But that was one of the suicide notes that she left. You can see the picture on the right there. That's where they brought out her body with a white sheet over it. There was a little more information, which I'll give you just in the following slides. But that's her body coming out of a hotel, which, as you can imagine, for Stevens in the investigation, is almost an end. Basically, the prime suspect is now gone. This was one of her notes, the main note, that they can say what they wish now and I can't object, but they would have anyway. I've decided this is no worse for Mark than the terrible widespread publicity of a trial, which is sure to crop up all his life. This will be less publicity and over sooner. So that was what she had decided. That had been one of the factors in her suicide, was that she thought a trial was going to ruin her son, Mark, who was only 3. at the time, and it would ruin his life. And so she felt that he would be better off without her, which of course is a tragic thing. So that was one of her suicide notes. And then, of course, there was the autopsy, and it emerged that she had been pregnant. She had either been pregnant and had a termination, or she had had a miscarriage. It was impossible to tell. Now, of course, at the time, and is again today in many places, terminations are illegal. You have to find, they were called an illegal operation at the time. So she had to find an illegal operation if she was in fact pregnant. If she wasn't and she'd had a miscarriage, that is just as traumatic and emotionally upsetting for a person to go through. And one can also imagine she was thinking of the trial that was coming up. What are people going to think if I walk into that trial and I'm pregnant, or people find out that I'm pregnant? They're going to assume things. They're going to assume who the father is. They're going to judge me for it. That may not be the case. I think we would do the same today, unfortunately, but I would imagine that would have been on her mind at the time, possibly, if she was indeed pregnant. There's the coroner's register on the right-hand side. It was a clear suicide. There was no foul play involved. Now, there were a number of things that were found in her room. I mean, I'm afraid I haven't referred to my notes very much, but there were a number of few things that she left behind. There was a little toy car, which we have to presume was for Mark. There was St. Christopher's medallion. One of the suicide notes included her suggestion of who Mark should go and live with after this, which unfortunately never happened. There was also a scrap of paper there, which again, the newspaper showed, "Happy Valentine, I love you." Now, whether that was her and who she meant it to, who knows, but that was something that was left behind. What was also left behind was this newspaper article talking about this, saying that 2 Seattle police detectives, off duty, of course, were investigating the case on behalf of the Wells family. And the 2 of them were actually going between Fairbanks and Seattle and coming down to LA and doing lie detector tests. They talked to Johnny, they talked to other people within Fairbanks, and that clipping was in her room after she committed suicide. So clearly something about that was problematic for her to keep it. And then, of course, came kind of an even more tragic news, as you see at the bottom. Beauty suicide may have been too soon. And what had happened was that Stevens, immediately once he'd heard about the suicide, postponed the trial. And it emerged that he was going to postpone it anyway. So in many ways, she necessarily might not have needed to go through with what happened. Of course, that's speculation, but it emerged that the trial was not going to go ahead. But she had killed herself because she thought the trial was coming and that it was going to ruin her son's life. I mean, and also in Alaska at the time, it was a death penalty case. I mean, Johnny Warren, remember, was charged as well. He could have been executed for this. I mean, it was very rare. It was very rare that anyone was executed, usually not white Caucasian people, but still it was a death penalty case. And Diane would have certainly gone to jail for a long time and never seen her son again, never seen Mark again. So that was the overall tragedy. But as I said, the Wells family were not happy with this investigation because now, of course, there was never likely to be a trial and they wanted justice. So they actually contacted Earl Stanley Gardner, who many of you, I'm sure, recognize, who created Perry Mason. That's Perry Mason in the middle, probably the most famous iteration of him. That's Raymond Burr, the actor. They also did it recently again with Matthew Rhys. They rebooted it. It wasn't as good. I wasn't such a fan of the newer one, but Raymond Burr obviously played Perry Mason for decades in lots of series and films and so forth. And Perry Mason, actually, his sister and niece lived in Fairbanks. He actually came to Fairbanks quite often, and it's quite likely he would have got to know even perhaps Cecil or some of the Wells family, but he might have well been the connection to Earl Stanley Gardner so that the Wells family could say, "Can you suggest someone to help with us?" And Earl Stanley Gardner did. He suggested a private investigator from Las Vegas. The guy did an investigation, couldn't find anything solid, couldn't find anything to prove that either Diane or Johnny had been definitely guilty of the murder. This brings us to the third suspect in the case. If you remember, I mentioned earlier, the US Marshal Frank Worth had spoken publicly about a third suspect, i.e. that he said he didn't think Johnny Warren was guilty. Well, he talked about a third suspect too, and he meant this man. He meant this man, William Columbany, who was born in Guatemala in 1923. He was a dance instructor. He had a dance studio in the Northwood building, you'll see, and he taught Cecil and Diane how to ballroom dance. They became friends and he became part of the community. He'd actually had a dance school in Anchorage as well. He'd been married in Anchorage. He was married just for about a year. He sold his dance school to his wife, moved up to Fairbanks, opened a dance school there. It was in his apartment. As far as I could tell, in the Northwood building, he got to know Cecil and Diane and became friends with them and seemed to be like a friend and a confidant. The picture on the top right, that's actually Columbany and Diane. Now, I don't know where that picture was taken and when, but they look pretty close. There were plenty of people who talked to me during my research and my interviews, and they said, you need to look at him. What was going on between the two of them? The big thing that was probably a giveaway or that was a major red flag was that I mentioned that Diane went down to Los Angeles after she got bail. William Columbany went down to Los Angeles very soon after. Now, his mother lived there and so did his sister. So he stayed with his mother and sister, of course, but he and Diane were soon pretty much inseparable. He spent a lot of time with her. He helped with Mark. He was the one who told the hotel manager, please keep an eye on my friend. She's on antidepressants, not that they would have called them those, but she's on tablets. Would you please keep an eye on her? He was also the guy, if you remember the picture we saw of Diane's body being wheeled out, there was a guy standing to the right of it with white pants with his back to the camera. That was William Columbany. He identified her body. So he had known, he had gone to the hotel to meet her, found out that she wasn't there, had gone round the corner to another hotel and had eventually found, arriving too late, obviously, at the Hollywood Plaza when her body was being wheeled out, and they had got in touch with him. He was arrested twice in Los Angeles. He was arrested initially after the suicide, which is quite understandable because he would have been one of the last people to see her alive. But he had also been arrested earlier in relation to the Cecil Wells murder, which I'll talk about, hoping this isn't getting too confusing. But what you also see in the bottom right there is a picture of William Columbany, a mugshot. Now, this was in the private notes of Frank Worth, the US Marshal. I have that photo now. His daughter sent me his notes. That's a mugshot of William Columbany. Now, I contacted Seattle PD and said, well, was he ever arrested for anything? Would you have ever had to take a mugshot of him? What was he? They had no record of him whatsoever. So how on earth did the Seattle police have a mugshot of William Columbany? And as all of you know very well, if you're in a police station getting a mugshot, there are other things that are happening. There are other things that are happening as well. And if you'll recall, there was that newspaper clipping in Diane's hotel room about the two off-duty Seattle detectives who were investigating the case with a lie detector. They were the ones, I think, and I can't prove it, I think that when they traveled back with William Columbany back to Fairbanks and they stopped in Seattle because, as you know, or a lot of you know, you usually have to go through Seattle to get up to Fairbanks, to get to Anchorage, to get to Fairbanks. And I think they stopped out and they went to their local police station because they were Seattle detectives. And that's where they took his mugshot and administered a lie detector test to him. And if he'd had a lie detector test administered to him and Diane heard about it or even imagined that was the case, she might have been particularly worried. If you follow me, that's the only explanation I can come up with him having a mugshot in Seattle. So he was called the third suspect, and Frank Worth always called him that regularly in newspaper reports, naming him as well during the investigation of the case, which can't have made Stevens too happy, or anybody else involved in the case, because he was publicly naming suspects. And William Columbany was not necessarily a suspect at all. He was obviously lived in the building, he had been questioned, but he did keep inserting himself into the case. He did keep talking and kind of becoming her advocate and even being an advocate for Johnny Warren as well, and kind of being involved and nosing his way into the case. And of course, he'd spent all that time with Diane in Los Angeles, but now it all looked like that it was over. Diane was dead. Johnny Warren was the minorest of suspects of circumstantial evidence. What was going to happen? So Ted Stevens, what was he going to do? He had a last roll of the dice. And you have to remember, Ted Stevens, this is early in his career, high profile murder, not going well. The main suspect commits suicide. It's an international sensation. Diane's suicide was covered internationally. I found pieces in Australia, pieces in England. It was a big deal, the suicide. And of course, the fact that the trial was not going to happen, that Stevens had called it off, didn't look good for him. There was a lot of bad optics going on here, as you might know the term today. So what did Ted Stevens do? He charged William Columbany, there's his mugshot again, with perjury in 1955. So this is a year after Diane's suicide. He charged William Columbany with perjury. Now, I'm sure all of you, again, know a lot more about perjury than I do. But it seemed odd to me that William Columbany was charged with perjury in relation to the trial that was supposed to happen in 1954, but didn't. That seemed an odd thing to charge someone for. And the case of perjury was pretty much, without going into too much detail, that William Columbany talked to another person in Fairbanks who knew Diane and was in the music scene. He had talked to this person in Fairbanks and said, look, if anyone asks, kind of make it that Johnny Warren was more involved in what happened with Cecil than Diane. That was basically what he said to this guy. The guy, of course, was like, well, why would I say anything if she's innocent? Why would I need to say anything? He's like, look, just make it clear that she didn't have anything to do with it. And at the same time, Columbany said, you know, they will take care of you if you do this for us. And also they will take care of you if you don't do this for us. Now, who they is, we don't know. But that was the charge that was levied by Stevens against Columbany for perjury. There was a perjury trial in Fairbanks. As you can see, top left, there's Columbany in the middle, looking relatively confident, as he was throughout the whole trial. On the right-hand side is a lady called Mildred Gillimore, who was an LA lawyer who had been involved in the LA side of it. She was on What's My Line a couple of years later, actually. She had a detective agency. And on the left, or rather on Columbany's right, is a woman called Catherine McAfee. And the newspapers didn't know who she was initially. She was sitting at the defense table with Columbany, but the next day, they managed to find out who she was. She was the wife of Guy McAfee, who was an LA cop turned mobster who set up the Golden Nugget in Las Vegas. Now, what Catherine McAfee, the wife of a famous Vegas mobster, was doing at William Columbany's defense table, I've no idea. She was not a lawyer. Maybe she was a friend. That's what she said. How William Columbany met the wife of a gangster, I've no idea. But that was a strange thing about the trial. And everyone was shocked when William Columbany was found guilty. As you can see there, bottom left. He got 60 days, which, again, as some of you might know, is a very short period for perjury. I think you can get several years for perjury. And it's a high crime as well. He served his 60 days in the local Fairbanks jail cell, which was unusual. There's also there top right, something again from Marshal Frank Worth's archives. It's a transcript of a conversation between an LAPD policeman and Ted Stevens. And the policeman says to Stevens, you know, do you think you've got a chance of convicting William Columbany in this charge of perjury? And Stevens, I'm not going to read it because you probably can't read it, but Stevens basically says, well, you know, we'll see. I'm not entirely sure. And that seemed to be the overall mantra for the whole case. It really didn't seem like it would ever be something that could come to trial because there really wasn't enough evidence. They never found the gun, for example. And so my point being is that William Columbany went to jail. He did 60 days. That night he got out. He went to a party at the party was, and one of the guests was the judge who'd sentenced him to 60 days in Fairbanks, as you do. And then the next day, William Columbia left Alaska, never went back again. He spent the rest of his life in Las Vegas. He worked in one of the casinos and spent the rest of his life in Las Vegas. He died there in 2011. So make of that what you will. But that was the third suspect of the story. And then finally, I'm sure you think I've not talked about Ted Stevens enough at all, but the case continued. In 1956, a trial date was announced for Johnny Warren and then postponed. And then the next month, Ted Stevens resigned as the district attorney in Fairbanks. Make of that what you will. He got a post in Washington and went on to an exceptional, lengthy, and occasionally controversial career, which I'm not going to tell any of you about because you all know about it. But I just wanted to share, there's some pictures of him throughout that era. That's him in the late 50s. That's him in the 70s. Top right, on the right-hand side is one which you will probably mention. And then, of course, there's the picture at the Anchorage airport. It was just so ironic to me when I came into Anchorage airport. I was like, goodness. So he had the airport named after him. And when the airport opened, that was the day that Cecil got killed. Cecil got murdered. I thought that was very strange. Just a weird coincidence. But the one quote I remember from Ted Stevens was that he said initially, way back at the beginning of the case, when Diane and Johnny pled not guilty, he told the court, he said, it was a plain and simple case of murder. But the fact was, he was never able to prove it. Ted Stevens was not able to prove it, or the DA was not able to prove it. The office, not the police, were not able to prove it. Law enforcement was not able to prove enough. And from what I gathered from my research, and again from what people had told me about what Ted Stevens said, no one ever thought it was better than a 50% chance of a conviction in a trial based on the evidence. So that was how Ted Stevens was related. And as far as I could tell, he never mentioned the case again. Certainly not publicly. I mean, it was a bit of a disaster. It was certainly a black eye on his early career. Didn't seem to affect his career, but he did resign after finally there might have been a trial, and it didn't go to trial. And then he resigned straight afterwards, whatever that means. And as you've obviously, I've just implied, the investigation was not over. Not for Johnny Warren anyway. He was still on the hook. He was still, charged with first-degree murder. And the police, to their credit, and Stevens, until he resigned, they tried really hard to connect him to that gun. They sent actually 4 guns to the FBI over the years. There's pictures of 2 of them, or what they would have looked like. Never got any matches with the FBI. I said they've sent 10 sets of fingerprints to local criminals. William Columbia's fingerprints were sent. A number of local criminals, a number of criminals who were much more famous for other crime later. They never got any matches to any of the fingerprints. They essentially never had anything against Johnny Warren. They could never match the gun, and they were trying to match the gun to him specifically. They even did, you'll read about it in the book, they went to some extreme, ridiculous lengths to try and get a link. They never found the gun. They could never link it. And then in 1960, post-statehood, he got that. He was exonerated. Now, I don't know how he got it, whether he just got a letter or a phone call, but he was exonerated of the crime. And as you can imagine, he never spoke of it again. He never spoke about it to his family members after that, because I spoke to them. Did statehood have anything to do with it? The fact that he was exonerated after statehood, the Wells family certainly thought so. They felt that Cecil's murder had been kind of pushed aside in relation to the push for statehood, which again, I'm not going to give you all the details about that because I'm sure you're all well aware of it. But there was an argument that this high-profile murder not being solved and a high-profile suicide of this young, attractive film noir type woman as well, plus the other 2 home invasion murders that were not solved in Fairbanks as well, did not look good and were not a good reflection on the 2nd or 3rd biggest city in a territory that was trying to be a state. Law enforcement was a big issue, and if you can't control law, if rich people are getting shot in their beds and no one's going to prison, it could be a problem. And the Wells family certainly thought the murder got pushed aside. because it wasn't solved and statehood was the bigger goal. Now, I'd love to discuss that with anyone who thought so, but it did come through, and that was something I never expected in my research. So just quickly now, because I'm sure you're getting bored, theories of the murder. As I said, Diane's statement, which she stuck to right until the end, even when she was writing suicide notes, she never blamed anyone else or said it was anyone else. Two unidentified thieves broke into the apartment, shot Cecil and attacked her. They did shoot Cecil. She was badly beaten. There have been a number of break-ins in the area in Fairbanks. So another rumor I heard was a professional hit, probably connected to organized crime. Now, there was nothing in the police or FBI files about that. They had just had that massive commission in the early 50s about organized crime, so it was on everyone's mind. Some people said to me, well, they thought Johnny Warren was a hitman. You know, they thought William Columbany was a hitman. You know, William Columbany was from Guatemala. He had an accent. You know, he must have been a hitman from another country. My argument against that, apart from the fact there was never anything in the files about it, was that if I had hired a hitman, people said Diane hired a hitman. If I had hired a hitman, I would not get the hitman to beat me up for authenticity. I would just get the hitman to, you know, tie me up and put me in a closet. That would be just as plausible. I wouldn't say, oh, and can you beat me up as well and give me 2 black eyes to make it look like I had nothing to do with it. Also, as somebody said, professional hitmen don't leave witnesses. They don't leave witnesses alive, and they left her alive. You know, she wasn't bleeding out on the floor. She was just unconscious. Another rumor was, of course, that it was Diane. She was a gold digger. She killed him for money, and they were going to run away together, she and Johnny. That didn't really have any basis. They'd not known each other for a long time, really, and Johnny was married too. He wasn't as keen on her as she were on his. She was unhappy in the marriage, and there were problems in the marriage. Long story short, it was proved, and I talked to people, and there were witness accounts that Cecil was an abusive husband. He would hit Diane, and I had several accounts of that. So I'd imagine their marriage wasn't as happy as we might have thought. I mean, again, they were an it couple, but again, this is the 50s. You know, a husband striking his wife, that was considered to be sort of private family business. You know, a husband or a father being rough with their children, that was considered good discipline. You know, it was a different time, but Cecil was an abusive husband. I have evidence of it with Diane and his previous wife. I mean, his previous wife, his 4th wife, was called to the inquest in his death. And she said, oh, yeah, he hit me in the street. He hit my sister in the street. People saw it. You know, he was an abusive husband. It certainly happened. And then the third rumor of that it was Johnny or Columbany as a lover or as a friend killed Cecil for whatever reason. Maybe Cecil came upon Johnny and Diane together. Maybe Cecil had beaten Diane up. She called her friend Columbany in the building because they were close, and he was angry and he came down. There was a struggle, or he was angry and he came down and he shot Cecil in his anger. You know, maybe he did have an unrequited crush on Diane, and he felt so angry about it. There was no unrequited crush on her behalf, as far as I'm aware. So there were rumors and there were theories, again, which I talk about in the book. And the last chapter of the book is what I think happened on the night of the murder. I assemble all the evidence from the interviews and the files, and I do a timeline of what I think happened on the night of the murder. But I do discuss the theories about it beforehand, because one of the things that amazed me within the families, and I interviewed a number of family members because Cecil had, 5 children. So some of those are still alive, and of course they had children as well, which are his grandchildren. So a lot of them I could interview, and it was amazing to me that almost none of them knew anything about the murder. It was very much something that was never talked about. It was very much a taboo subject. And so whilst I expected some of them to be like, we don't want to know, we don't want to know, nearly all of them were, please tell us what we know, because no one ever talked about it to us. I was always told that it was Diane that killed him. I was always told that it was Johnny Warren that killed him. That was all they knew. That was what sort of propelled me in the research, to try and find out what happened and what happened to the people. And then just a little bit at the end, what happened to these people and what happened to them at the end. Top left, or my top left, that's me and Sandra, who was Diane's first daughter. We saw a little picture of her way back. Now, Diane and Sandra and Bonnie were estranged from Diane. They didn't see her after Sandra was about 10 years old, which was a real shame. But again, I talk about that in the book, and Diane didn't abandon them. If nothing else, her will had $10 left to each of her kids, but Sandra and Bonnie, address unknown. So that's Sandra, who I interviewed in Texas. So that's Diane's eldest daughter. And of course, she looks just like her mother. Why would she not? Top right, that's Johnny Warren in later years. He looks just the same as he did in all the pictures. And then on the bottom right is me and John Warren, Johnny Warren's son. He had a son much later in his life when he was in his early 60s. He had a much younger wife too, funnily enough. And he had a son, John, who's just got married actually himself for the third time, funnily enough. So I met him when I was in Texas as well. And then I guess the saddest part of the story was Mark, Diane and Cecil's son, who was only 3 when all of this happened. So he was called, the newspapers called him a murder orphan, which was awful. Or a millionaire orphan was what they called him, because of course he was now a millionaire child, because Cecil had all these interests and businesses and so forth. So he was now an extremely wealthy child. And there's a bit of a custody battle that didn't seem to be particularly unpleasant, but there were a lot of people who said they would come in and look after him. And he ended up with Cecil's sister, Edna, and that's a picture of Mark there with Edna. But he was batted around a lot between a lot of family members. And it's a question I get asked the most. He did not have a great life. I talk about it in the book. He and I did speak once before he said he didn't want to have anything to do with the book, but he did not have a happy life at all, which I guess is no surprise, really. Money doesn't make up for something like that. And Mark had his own son, also called Mark. He didn't have a particularly happy life with his father either. And my point being is that, as you will have all found or will find, violence affects generations of people. The spider web that comes out from an act of violence, it just goes on for generations, for years and years and years. This murder happened 70 years ago. I was talking to people in their 70s and 80s. We're going, whatever you find out, please tell me. I don't know. They never talk to me about it. People won't talk to me about it. I don't know what happened. There's a hole in my history. And so that's it. So the book is The Alaskan Blonde. You can get it. Hopefully Tidal Wave have managed to make it through the snow, perhaps, and are outside. If not, it's on Amazon and Audible and Barnes & Noble. There's more stuff at The Alaskan Blonde on Instagram, and there's a website where I post loads more documents and loads more pictures. There's obviously so much more to talk about. There's nothing as unusual and strange and as affecting as a true life story. And I've just given you a tiny amount of it. So please have a look there if you're interested, because there's so much more in the book. It's really interesting. And does anyone have any questions?
Before we go there, James, first, thank you so much.
Yeah.
That was wonderful.
Yeah, I can't tell if any of you all left while I was doing it.
A few people had to leave.
Yeah.
And James has told me that he's available for questions for a while. Just in case anybody else has to go, I wanted to be sure to thank you now and give you a round of applause for that great presentation, and then
Thank you. You're all welcome. I'm putting my email address in the chat if any of you want to get in touch. Yes, there is a couple of questions here. Yes, Johnny played a number of instruments, actually. It was just that picture happened to be him playing the drums. Let's see if there's anyone on Zoom they want to ask. I don't have to go anywhere. Yes. Ironically, the courthouse in Fairbanks is now where Cecil's car dealership was. Isn't that crazy? I mean, there's nothing that I'm sure you're all familiar cases that there'll be nothing as strange as what happens in real life. So yeah, where Cecil's dealership was is now the courthouse in Fairbanks. So thank you all for coming. You can all send me a question if you like. Yes, no, I did look that up, Tristan. That was one of the things I found out when I read about that, because I read about the suicide. I read about the suicide first. And as soon as I read about it, I thought, well, I'll have to read a book of that. And then I thought to myself, there wasn't a book. So then I thought, well, I bet they made a film about this in the 50s because it's such a film noir story. No, there really wasn't much done about it. There was the media coverage. There was a big fuss when the murder happened and a big fuss with the suicide. But then there was nothing else after that. There were family members who did hire private detectives and assemble material and do interviews. Several people did that, actually, who I spoke to, but I guess they never got round to putting it into a book or something. I mean, I think a lot of the Wells family members certainly told me they thought, people just didn't care anymore. No one cared about something that happened 70 years ago, so they didn't bother. But the thing is, the family members all cared about it, and friends, and they all wanted to know what had happened, even though it was a long time ago. They still wanted to know. So that was about an hour. It wasn't too boring, was it?
No. Great.
Okay. And did anyone in the room seem to perk up and like they remembered any of this? I realized there wasn't as much about Ted Stevens as probably everyone wanted, but
We didn't have anybody here in the room that seemed like they remembered anything. I don't know if there was anyone online.
yeah. I mean, what's this? What drew me to the story, Megan? It was when I found out about the suicide, and I saw that it was related to a murder in Alaska, and I thought, how unusual. And then I did a bit of digging online and couldn't really find anything, and I was surprised. And then actually early on, I managed to get in touch with one of the family members, actually Diane's youngest daughter. I managed to get in touch with, and she had been online making the same request, trying to find out if anybody had really knew what had happened. And that really was interesting. And that put me in touch with Diane's other daughter. And that put me in touch with Mark himself, or his son first, and then Mark. And I spoke to Mark very early on, and he seemed extremely excited to talk to me and couldn't wait to get going on a book. And then he, as I write about it in the book, but then he wrote me a letter saying he didn't want to do it. That Diane had, sort of hurt, and it hurt too many people what happened, and he didn't want to carry on with it. I didn't go to Ted Stevens's family, no. I mean, because I looked into his archives. I don't know where his archives are. Are they at UAF? I think they might be, but he does have an archives, and I was told there wasn't really anything there. And I did do some other research and listen to a couple of interviews. He never talked about it publicly. Now, whether he might have said something in private about it, but what would he have said other than, I think, I'm sure she did it / he did it, but we could never prove it. That was what seemed to be the ultimate legal summary of it, was that they could never really prove what happened. They just didn't have enough. And, once she was dead, that was it. You were never going to be able to prove it. Yes, the Polaris building in Fairbanks is actually being destroyed as we speak. It's been empty for decades, and they're actually taking it apart now and going to build it. But there was a restaurant at the top. And yes, please, Karen, ask, because if he was around at that time, people remember it. People in Fairbanks of a certain age definitely remember the story, but their knowledge stops. They go, well, I don't remember what happened. It never went to trial. Most of them didn't know that Diane died. They certainly didn't know that William Columbany, went to prison for perjury. I mean, that was the only conviction in relation to the Cecil Wells murder was, the perjury conviction. Alas, Columbany died, 10 years ago. I would have asked him. There was a lady who I spoke to early on who was a journalist in Fairbanks, and she found him. She spoke to him, William Columbany, in Vegas. He wouldn't talk about it. Wouldn't say anything about it. So yes, Northwood, yes, lots of people stayed there. Yes, that's Karen Hawkins. Yes, lots of people stayed in, it's Karen again, yes. Lots of people stayed in the Northwood building. I did speak to a lot of people who lived there or spent a lot of time there, because it was quite the social center in downtown. So a lot of people knew the building. Everybody knows the Northwood building in Fairbanks even now. But yes, do ask, because they may well remember it. I mean, the irony of irony is that when I went up to Fairbanks last time in October to do some talks, I went into the Northwood building again. They had a copy of the book on top of the water cooler, which I thought was pretty cool. I was pretty chuffed about that, because I was like, you realize that was the murder that happened in this building. But yes, they had a copy of it there. And, I got the plan, the sort of the blueprinty thing of how the rooms were all set out and who could see what and whether you could see anything, you know, if you could see, if there was a gunshot, whether anyone could have heard it, whether you could have seen a flash of a gun. That was the other thing. No one heard a gunshot. No one saw the flash. You know, I mean, I thought I was going to get grilled by all the lawyers about that stuff. But I mean, I talk about it in the book, you know, the evidence that they had, but no one heard anything and no one saw anything. So.
James,
Yes.
quick question. I couldn't find the, well, let me ask you. I was born in Monterey, California,
Mhm.
and I remember the story you're talking about in Carmel. When was Diane in Carmel?
That would have been when she was in her early, let me think, 20s.
What year would that have been?
That would have been in the 40s. Maybe
Was
a
that
little
built-
bit later than, yeah, maybe in the 40s, late 30s, early 40s.
Was that building built then? Was she
Which building?
in the photograph in Carmel?
Oh, you mean the department store?
Yes.
Oh, I don't know.
I don't think
I mean,
so.
that was just something I happened to read, was that she had been a model there at some stage, which I presumed was when she was younger.
I don't think it was there yet. So, okay.
Okay, it could have been after that, or it could have been later on. I mean,
Okay.
she had the family sort of, her mother was in San Francisco, in around San Francisco for years, right up until like the 70s.
How long
And I'm
was she,
sure she went.
how long did she live in the peninsula in Monterey, California?
I think once she got married to Donald, they moved up to Washington State.
Okay.
And then I think she was pretty much there and,
Okay.
and further north from then on. She was married to Donald for 10 years. And they got divorced. He apparently, and I did speak to his wife, or I was told about his wife. Apparently he never got over her. That was what I was told. And talked about her until he died. And again, this is all in the book, and it's all like these bits of research he found. Apparently his song, or the song that he think reminded him of Diane the most, was Dave Brubeck, Take 5. Yeah. That's what he said. He said that she said he would play that song. He said, this reminds me of Diane.
We're dangerous. But thank you very much.
Well, I'm glad. I hope it was enjoyable. Thank you. Thank you everybody for coming. I do appreciate it.
James, we have one more question here. This is Kara
Yes.
at the Alaska Bar Association. We have one more question in the room, but then we're going to need to in the Q&A, just because we have to be out of this room in about
Yes.
5 minutes.
Yes, absolutely.
Vic, what was your question again?
Where did he get all of his money to start his businesses?
That's a good point. His family were involved in auto trading and garages. His father was. He followed into the family business. So he did that first where the family was, and then he moved across country. He did try a bit of gold mining in Alaska initially. That didn't really pan out. And then he opened a garage. So he had a long history in the auto business. And being in Alaska, that means like parts and servicing and maintenance, and all for like, you know, work trucks and mining trucks and that kind of stuff, not just cars. He was involved in a taxi service, got involved in a bus service at one time, because, you know, there was nothing like that there. So yeah, he made a lot of that through cars initially. Then he got into gold mining. Then he was doing investment in local businesses. Yeah, he had his fingers in quite a few pies.
Well, thank you again, James. It was great.
Thank you. You're welcome. You're very welcome. Yes.